question, James. I'd like to start out with a quote from a book titled "For One More Day," written by Mitch Albom. There's a story behind everything, but behind all your stories is always your mother's story, because hers is where yours begins. Now, when Elizabeth asked me if I would speak on this day, I said yes, before I really thought it out. And I spent most of a week struggling with what am I going to talk about. Because growing up, I had a great childhood, I really did. 3 brothers, a mother and father who loved me. But yet, my mother and I, it seemed to me at the time, growing up, were not as close as a lot of mothers and daughters. And so I was thinking on this, and I got to thinking back over growing up and the fact that my mother succumbed to Alzheimer's disease on May the 5th, 2008. But we lost her to that devastating condition years before. And I learned at that time that no matter how prepared you are, you're never really prepared to lose somebody you love and somebody who has been in your life all your life. Now, Mom taught me many things, like cooking, sewing, the basics. She taught me to respect my elders and not to talk back, although I forgot that a few times after I hit my teenage years. My mom and I, as I said, we're not as close as some moms and daughters are. And I'm not sure if it's because we were so different from each other or too much alike. Maybe a little bit of both. And she put salt on her grapefruit and sugar on her tomatoes. She was a liberal, and I'm an independent conservative. She disowned me for that reason alone. When I was about 13 or 14, I was told to do a few chores. I fussed about having to do all the work and procrastinated until she said, if you had done the things I asked you to do when I asked you to do them, you'd be done. And you'd be able to be doing the things that you want to do right now. Well, I figure I started really learning things about that time, especially about life and interacting with people and everything. I thought, she's right. I would be done, and I wouldn't be grounded for a week. As Larry the Cable Guy says, get her done. Then you have time to play. Mom's favorite hobby was reading. That woman read everything. She had all kinds of books she read her Bible. Every National Geographic that came in, she read from cover to cover. And as I got older and listened to her, I realized what a self-educated woman she was. For somebody who only graduated high school, she knew a lot about space travel. She knew a lot about Africa. She knew a lot about the government and things going on in the United States. She was an avid reader. She never stopped learning. So as I thought of these things, then I also started thinking about my own children and things that I learned from my mother that I passed on to my children. Both of them are avid readers, as I am, as my mother was. In fact, my mom, when I was probably about 10, started me on a series of books like that she had read when she was my age, called Cherry Ames, R.N. I don't know if any of you ever remember it. Came out about the same time as Foxy Twins and all that stuff. And every time I got all my chores done and behaved myself and didn't sass back, I got a book, which I would devour in a matter of a couple of days and want another one. So in between books, I got Barbie doll clothes. And as I thought about these things, about how close I was with my mother or wasn't with my mother, I remember the things that we went through with her Alzheimer's. And the one thing that really surprised me was every time I saw her, even to the end, she always knew me. She couldn't say my name, but she knew me. And when she was passing and I got the call from the hospice nurse that it was time to come, and I grabbed my kids and we drove 14 hours to Texas to get there. She was waiting for me to get there to tell her goodbye. Now, I never cried for the loss of my mother because it really had mixed feelings. And after studying through this, writing these things down, I realized that my mother and I were closer than I thought, and that she taught me many things. And she taught me how to love. And I know that, well, one of the things that she always said was when she died, she hoped that God blessed her with a singing voice because she didn't have one on earth and she loved to sing the hymns. So I know that my mom is singing with the angels for God today. Thank you for letting me share.
I think someplace in the Bible it says this even. And now we live in America.
My mother, Dola Anthropus, was born Dola Grace Jones in 1903, and she passed away in the year 2000, and she was an angel. She only lost her temper twice that I remember. Once at me, and I don't know why that, and once at my father, and I can understand that. When she'd get mad at me, she'd call me Mary Margaret. Okay, my mother had a generous heart and a loving heart, and I know she worked at the church, but also she put up with my dad. He would bring home almost every week either a wounded animal or a wounded person. The Korean War was going on when I was little, and we lived down the street here on Raymond Street. And every Sunday he would go down and bring 4 or 5 soldiers home. And Mother never complained about that. She'd have dinner ready when we'd leave church. And when he'd pick them up, they'd all come to church. And we'd go back to our house, and she'd have dinner, which I'm sure she started the dinner before we went to church. And we'd have dinner, and then we'd sit around and play cards, and then the soldiers would come back to church, and they'd dance. And I think Mary Anderson was always here, with Charlie, and Maxine, and Jerry. And they would have parties on Sunday evenings, and the young people would dance. And then, let's see. Well, my mother raised 3 children. My 2 brothers, Charles and Phil. And there were always neighborhood kids at our house. and she never complained about all the kids. My dad always called her an angel, and she always put up with the kids and everything that my dad did. He was a professional gambler, so every weekend, my brother and myself, and any kid that was on the porch on Friday evenings, my dad would come home and say, let's go to Chicago. And we'd load up the car and off we'd go to Chicago. And my mother never complained. One time when we was in Chicago, my parents put the kids up in a hotel room, and my mother and dad stayed in a room in the basement. Well, the next morning, this was before air conditioning, so the windows opened. The boys had balloons. They filled them full of water and threw them out at people. And we got kicked out of the hotel. So my mother and I went shopping. I got rewarded. My dad took the boys on a boat in Lake Michigan and told them to hit the waves so they'd get sick. But he got sick, and they left him. But she didn't complain about that either. One time, our family and another family, which is Bonnie Johnson, Bonnie Huber, that you all know, her family, we used to go out to dinner out on the west side, east side, in Cumberland, New Palestine. And on the way back from eating at the restaurant, we stopped at an auction. And my dad bought a billy goat. And we had a station wagon, so he put the billy goat in the back seat, straddling me, my brother, Bonnie, her brother, her mother, her grandmother, my mom and dad, with the big billy goat. And all the way home, my dad stopped at every tavern. Him and the goat went in and had beer. So by the time we got home to Raymond Street, the goat was loopy. And my mother never complained, except she made my dad sleep with the goat on the front porch. And the neighbors finally started complaining about the smell, so we had to get rid of the goat. On the day the goat left, I think we sold it to Roger Rumpke. If anybody remembers the Rumpkes, they used to come to our church. They bought the goat. And my mother cried when they loaded up the goat. But she never complained. Years later, when my dad was trying to quit drinking, this was the second time she lost her temper. She threw a measuring cup at the wall. And I asked her why she stayed with my father. And she said that he was a good husband and a person, and she knew God would not want her to leave. My dad and mother moved into our house in the early 80s, where I'm living now. My father passed away in '85. When it became apparent for her that she could no longer drive, my husband had just bought a brand new truck, and he had it parked in the driveway, and she was going to go to the store. So when she went to back out, she hit the truck. Well, she couldn't figure out what was back there, so she went forward, come back, and hit it again. And she knew she hit the truck that time, so she brought the keys in and said, I'm not driving anymore, and she never complained about that anymore. A lot of times, when you have to take the keys away from parents, it's really, really, really hard. But it was easy for her. She just said, I don't need to be driving anymore. So when the time came, she needed to go to a nursing home. Both of us cried for a week. You know, I'd go visit her, leave, and we'd cry. In about a week, she says, this is what I need to do. I won't complain anymore. So I know, and the people that knew her, knew that she was an angel on earth that walked among us.
Well, I'm beginning to get to reality that my good folk here at Olive Branch could be in a reality television show easy. But I want to get this clear, Mary and Massey. Did you guys have dancing downstairs with the military folk, or was this a speakeasy? Or was this a speakeasy at one time?
No.
Well, we did. We used to have dances, right?
Miss Pat.
Well, now we know why Mary's the way she is.
goat's fault.
They said I had choices, so I picked parenting. I'm going to take you inside the Herbig household. Are you prepared?
No.
Have you been to a three-ring circus? Yeah. You can't watch all three circles at the same time. That was life at the Herbig household. I was married at 19 and thought I knew everything. I'm 84, I know nothing. They taught me that. I had my first child at 21, my last one at 29. I had 4 children in 8 years, 2 girls born the same day, 2 boys in the middle. If I expected the worst, they never disappointed me. I think I looked up parenthood and I looked up mother in the encyclopedia, and it didn't cover. Motherhood is something that you are loving, joyful, anxious, infuriated, forgiving, crazy, thoughts of leaving home, all included as a disguise of motherhood. And that described me at certain times over my period of life. We had a rule at our house. We had rules and we had boundaries. I found that was the only way that I could handle it for Herbig was to give them rules and boundaries and consequences if they were broken. And to this day, they remember the rules and the boundaries. And it kept me sane. Otherwise, I would have been insane a long time ago. My grandchildren also know rules and boundaries, and I think we do our children an injustice when we don't let them know how far they can go, either in their rules or their boundaries, because this world will show them those rules and boundaries if we don't. So that was my main parent guiding. You broke the rules, you suffered the consequences. And they all knew that. My children were always welcome to bring friends home, and it was nothing to wake up on some mornings and have 4 or 5 people rolled up in blankets on the front room floor. And we would walk through and Mike would say, "Who's this?" "Who's that?" And on Sunday, when we became janitors of Olive Branch, communion was part of our duties. And our teenagers' job was to pick up, and that's when we had glass cutters, guys, not plastic. They would pick up after church, and then they would rotate downstairs to do the dishes, as we call them, while Mike and I closed up the church and checked things out. Well, and all of a sudden, there were several others down there helping. And then, all of a sudden, their parents had gone home, and I had 4 or 5 extra people following me home from church. So Sunday morning, there was always a big pot of something on the stove, because I never knew how many were going to follow me home. We also had a rule that no matter how late you stayed out, you came to church on Sunday morning. And sometimes there was more than 1 or 2 that didn't want to come to church, but they didn't have a choice. That was the rule. Philip had several friends who stayed over. Barbara, how many times do you suppose Gary slept at our house?
I couldn't count all the times.
They would shove the twin beds together, and there would be Gary and Philip and usually Drew Lester. And one Sunday morning, they decided they weren't going to get up. And I called, and silence in the stairway. So I went up the stairs, and I could hear him snicker. Went by the door to the bathroom, got the wettest, soggiest washcloth I could find, walked in, raised up the bottom of that bed, and went up every bare leg I could find. Up they popped, and they got the church on time. I had a lot of daughters by adoption. Jenny, do you remember where we kept our drinking glasses?
Where you kept the drinking glasses? Oh, I can find almost anything in that house.
We kept them in the freezer. Remember, if you wanted that cold glass, you went to the freezer. because when Philip was a baby, he wouldn't drink milk unless it was ice cold. Well, Philip's 57 years old today, and I still have glasses in my freezer. Old habits are hard to break. 4 children. Mary and Paul were serious. Philip and Martha were clowns. Now you put that mixture together at the dinner table, and there was usually food flying out of somebody's mouth from something was said during the time. It was a fun time. It was a serious time. It's when I got gray hair. It's when Mike got thinner. Mike had the patience. I didn't. I just got back from San Diego last week for a graduation of Philip's youngest daughter. While I was there, he told his son how horrible his mother was to him when it came to schoolwork, because he brought home a C when he was in high school. And then he pretended to tell Nicholas that his mother went back to that teacher to see why he got that C. Embarrassed him to tears. But you know what the teacher said? Well, poor Philip, he can't measure up to Mary and Paul, so you really have to be patient with him. I said, he's smarter than the other two because he's got you snowed. Oh! That you cracked down on him, and you cracked down hard. And that was the last seed Philip ever brought home. I was hard, and I was tough on him. But I also knew the world was going to be hard and tough on him. And they've all had problems up and down with their marriages, with divorces, with sick children, with job losses. But they were tough. And maybe even though I was mean and tough on them, that toughness is worn through. They give them the stamina and the strength to do what they were supposed to do. I passed that on to my grandchildren. I have 10 of them, all as different as day as night. But they also know Grandma's rules. We stayed at Martha's house for 2 weeks when she was changing jobs. Her youngest is 8 and a firecracker. And she threw a fit over something that I had said no to and stalked upstairs. Now her 2 older sisters were watching this to see how far we'd go. Mike said, what are you going to do? I walked up the stairs. I did not knock on her door. I opened the door and there sat an 8-year-old this way. I didn't sit down to console her. I didn't sit down to tell that her feelings were hurt. I didn't give her a chance to talk back. I said to her, we will be here a week and a half. I can make your life wonderful or I can make it a living hell. It's up to you. And I walked out. We had a wonderful week and a half. Surprisingly, she still likes me best. I love email because I can get in touch with each of my grandchildren and children quickly. Of course, they don't always read it right away. In fact, I have a couple that I write to periodically to say, have you died and no one told me? I haven't heard from you. Or I find if I ask questions, then they have to answer back.